Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for helping us get all set up. And this is a pretty cool setup. I've sat in on the other side where you are on a couple of these sessions, so I'm excited to share with you what Steve and I have put together tonight. At any point, drop any questions or thoughts that you have into the public chat, and we'll try to keep up with that or get back to it as needed. And tonight, Steve and I are just going to talk to you about reading historical documents rhetorically. And I mentioned when we talk about historical documents, we're going to stray into some literature and a few other things too. So my name is Lloyd Hoshaw. I do teach at a suburban high school outside Omaha, Nebraska, and I actually co-teach a combination group of kids who are taking AP Lang and AP US History. And that's how I got interested in this transfer between historical documents and the rhetoric that we usually teach in AP Lang. And I learned a lot of this, or started this journey with Steve several years ago in APSI. So Steve, you want to tell us a little bit about your experience?
Sure. Thank you, Lloyd, and welcome, colleagues. We appreciate the privilege of your time. Like Lloyd, I teach AP Language and Comp, and like Lloyd, I co-teach an American Studies class that prepares students for both the AP Language and Comp and AP US History exams. Long before we began this journey, and for me at my school, it's been about 6 years, I recognized that the AP Language and Comp questions really often benefited from knowledge of history. Now, that was never a requirement, nor was it ever in the scoring guide for AP Language and Comp. But with the recent changes in the course and exam description, with particular emphasis on identifying the rhetorical situation, both Lloyd and I feel and agree that a knowledge of history helps students understand the importance of context, author and audience, or speaker and audience relationship, and all the other features of the rhetorical situation. And so you don't have to be an American Studies teacher to appreciate the study of history, but it does allow us to objectively address those very important goals right in Unit 1. How do we teach students about the rhetorical situation? And so this journey with history is really an exciting one for us.
Yeah, and as Steve alluded to, this is one of the things that really excites me about teaching in general, and I appreciate the College Board pointing this out as well, is that, of course, we're teaching for understanding with our content and our skills, or our content, but it's the transfer that really makes makes AP Lang super powerful for students. Becomes a tool that they can use in so many other classes. And so by already showing them the transfer between AP Lang and some of these history classes, I think it reinforces that thinking as they carry the skills forward into any of their other classes as well. So we're going to start tonight with one of the big concepts being how to use those historical documents to enhance the understanding of the rhetorical situation.
Right.
And these are just references on the CED pages, so the curriculum and exam binder and guide. So this is just about the rhetorical situation. Steve?
Yeah, and I just, as long as we're on this slide, just to point out too that I think one of the things that students can recognize by looking at history is a writer's exigence. What's really the issue, the problem, the conflict that needs to come out and needs to be communicated in a constructive manner. And again, a knowledge of history gives us that distance and that objectivity to understand that. That's not to say that we can't appreciate the context of an inaugural address or the tragic event that preceded the inauguration, but it does give us a little more objectivity and stepping back and looking back in time. So, Lloyd, can we switch over one?
Yeah, and so I just wanted to point this out because I know when the CED came out, it was pretty overwhelming. There was a lot of information in there. And what I've found is something that I overlooked at first, but I've gotten to go back and find and discover is as you dig through the CED, they do for each skill have this section where it talks about key questions. And those questions are generalized enough that you can use them for so many different texts. They're not tied to one specific text. And I found that I literally start teaching my students some of these questions so that when they're not sure what to do or they look at a text and I say, so what should we talk about? And they just stare blankly. They know to start thinking about these particular questions. Well, how does the writer consider the rhetorical situation? So I just wanted to point that out in the CED.
Thank you. And let's look at one historical document that illustrates a lot of the objectives of today's presentation, and that's the Declaration of Conscience by Maine Senator Margaret Chase Smith. She's writing in 1950, and one of the things that students will have read before they come to this is Arthur Miller's The Crucible. And so even though they're reading The Crucible in context of studying the Puritans, I do point out to them that, look, a lot of this has to do with McCarthyism. And so they're getting a little bit of backstory in terms of what a witch hunt might look like back in Puritan times and also in modern times. Now, the curious thing about Margaret Chase Smith's Declaration of Conscience is that she's speaking to her fellow senators. In fact, let me please, colleagues, read this prompt to you. On June 1, 1950, U.S. Senator Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican, delivered her speech called the Declaration of Conscience to the Senate, where she condemned the American government's anti-communist witch hunt, an effort led by fellow Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy. Chase was an initial supporter, but she later changed her views. Read the excerpt carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Chase uses to condemn the witch hunt and remind senators of their purpose. Now, a couple of things on the slide, colleague, just to point out. Number one, we have a situation where she is preaching to the quote-unquote choir. So often in a rhetorical situation, we see people who are speaking to a hostile audience, or we recognize the exigence because people are sitting on opposite sides of the aisle. But what does it look like when you are speaking to your friends? Not unlike Neville Longbottom. How do you stand up to your friends and how do you move them forward here? Also, too, notice the areas of focus: government, witch hunts, looking at the same party members. And it invokes knowledge of history, whether it's the Salem witch trials in 1693, the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, or frankly, even more modern day examples of xenophobia. So it's a nice document that allows us to understand the rhetorical situation. Next slide, Lloyd. Now, go ahead, Lloyd. I'm sorry, did I cut? You want to say something? Now, the other thing, too, or another thing to keep in mind is that one of the moves that Margaret Chase Smith makes in her Declaration of Conscience is to invoke the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights. So yes, in an American Studies class, it makes sense to have read the Constitution. They understand the seminal documents. And she is, in the middle of her speech, reminding her colleagues of what their senatorial duties are. And I'll just read you the excerpt on the bottom: the right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, the right of independent thought. And so by students understanding the Bill of Rights, the reasons the Constitution came into being, when they're studying Margaret Chase Smith's rhetoric, they have something to frame that. It's not just her getting angry with her own people over an excessive witch hunt, which I think is legitimate to see, but rather, what is the broader context? Therefore, shout out to a prior text. We also look at rhetoric that moves in a linear manner. What I tell my students, it moves from point A to point B. Now, what I mean by that is that when you are taking your colleagues and moving them to a new point of view, we need to study how to do that. And we don't see it just one time. In fact, on the bottom of the slide, we have shared with you other examples of very similar rhetorical situations where someone is speaking to an audience that on the surface is on their side. But there's a certain exigence that starts to be revealed early on, and they have to move them to a common ground. So, for example, part one of Margaret Chase Smith's speech immediately immerses us into the problem. There's no need to establish common ground, unlike, for example, Lincoln's rhetoric, where most of the time he's speaking to at least half of an audience that doesn't like him. Part two, we now need to take a step back. Let's look at the causes and effects of this problem. In this case, we have forgotten the origins of our country. We've strayed away from the freedom of speech. We have allowed this witch hunt to censor people. And then last but not least, how do we move forward with a call to action to uphold the Bill of Rights? A new vision. And I would say that that's a very good thing for students to do. Lloyd mentioned transfer. When you have an issue, when you have a problem, even among your own kind, and you want to move forward, you want to avoid you're right and I'm wrong. You want to avoid this sort of binary. How do you move the discussion forward? How do you find a new vision? That's a good life lesson for all of our students to learn. So I think it's a nice trope that appears not with every rhetorical analysis, but certainly on the AP exam, but more importantly, don't conform. Just because your friends are your friends doesn't mean you got to follow their lead all the time, like Neville.
Excellent. And so helping them kind of dig into that rhetorical situation and how they're trying to move an audience, that's really where we want to take this discussion next is, so how do you build off that relationship between the audience and the speaker? We're often talking about that. But one thing that we found is if we can look at the relationship in values or priorities, that we'll really be able to see ways that the writer's making a choice to impact their reader or their listener, and how that audience is maybe a dynamic audience that changes over time. So one thing that I found for my own classroom is my students would often answer when I'd ask about an audience with a really generic statement of, well, they're writing to all Americans or writing to all women. And I always was trying to pull more from the students. And I realized, I wanted them to talk about specific traits or behaviors or choices. And I started thinking about where we do that. And we often do that in advertising. And so I found this actual graphic of market segmentation. And I started teaching my students or sharing this with them about how market analysis is done for products or TV shows or anything like that. And then I said, now we need to start using that kind of language when discussing audience, so that we don't just say, oh, they're writing to farmers. Let's try and think about age. Let's try and think about these other concepts, these values and hobbies and habits that maybe they anticipate their audience would have, and how that influences their choices. And then I moved to an even bigger view, which was heavily influenced from sociology. There's a sociologist, Robin Williams. At first, I thought it was tied to the comedian and was disappointed to find out that it was a sociologist, but it turns out it's still useful and great. He put forth that there are these 10 American values, meaning that it doesn't really matter where you are on this value. They're important to Americans. They're important to American identity or culture. And so these categories, again, I share with my students. And then as we read a text like the Declaration of Conscience, I then make them connect it to these broader beliefs and values. Not that there's a right answer, but that if they want to say, well, the Declaration of Conscience is really about individuality or about equal opportunity, that's going to create a different essay than the student right next to him who says, no, I think it's more about democracy and freedom and liberty. They're using the same text, but they're going to take it in different directions because they've isolated different values. And I found this to be a really helpful way to get them to think beyond their own response, their own personal response. And this, again, just kind of ties back to these statements about how writers make choices based on the situation that they're in. And I use those beliefs and values to kind of isolate, or actually to give them something to connect to. And Steve wanted to talk a little bit about this phrasing of dynamic audiences.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting notion. And I think it's really in some ways at the heart of reading rhetorically, because we're always used to, or at least we're often used to thinking about characters as dynamic. When we're looking at this central protagonist or who gets most of the airtime in a text. But when we think about audiences as dynamic, we're moving them, we're understanding how audiences are moved from point A to point B. How do we understand, and I'm quoting the scoring guide here for rhetorical analysis, how do we understand how a writer's choices reflect their purpose, their message, or as Lloyd described, their values? And I think that's a really useful mind frame or mindset for our students to think, okay, well, the audience felt this way at the beginning of the speech, but by the end of the speech, they've been moved to think about X or Y. And this idea of a changing audience really gets at the core of that the speaker-receiver relationship. So I mentioned we read The Crucible, and The Crucible is a really good study in how not all audiences are created equally, because if you are looking for witches, you're going to find witches. And if you're looking for looking for justice. Well, in the Crucible, you're not going to find it, but you can look for it and you might find an ally. So, but we hear the phrase "know your audience," so it's a nice compliment to what Lloyd just shared with us, because in between the two characters with Hale and Danforth, both reverends, both representing the church or the larger institution, the governing body, they're speaking to competing values, and it's a common trope in American history. We love our security, we love our individuality, but those two don't often go hand in hand. So Hale, he's forgive me. Yes,
No,
okay.
no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say Hale's line is really one that is speaking for justice and trying to get Danforth to see that he's being an extremist, whereas Danforth is saying the opposite, and that there's victimhood. I think that's such a powerful word. There's been victims. Somebody's been hurt. Somebody's been hurt, and it stokes the fires of fear and allows us to see an issue much differently. And so, but again, know your audience, and a lot of times those competing values. Thanks, Lloyd.
Sure. And again, just to plug how those key questions, when you look back into them, this one about audiences, beliefs, values, or needs, how do they focus, how do they reflect the biases and possibly affect the response of their audience? And if you start thinking about, these two reverends have so much in common, but they have competing values, or they prioritize different values. One prioritizes certain aspects over another. Then you start to see the choices they're making as they move their audiences, or what that's about. And again, there's nothing magical about this list other than it gives my students the vocabulary and something to aim for. It gives them targets that are beyond the text itself. So they're saying, okay, if we're going to do the McCarthy's speech, then what do I really want to write about? This is really about this bigger idea. And I find that helps them with their development and their commentary in their writing as well.
Hey, Lloyd, I know we're going to move forward.
Yep.
I may just go back one slide, please, just for a second. Colleagues, I would offer this, and I'm thinking about this just spontaneously, but it seems to me that Lloyd and I have discussed how often fear rears its head as what we think of as our values. But I would submit this evening that I think that fear is what happens when one of these values is threatened, or one of these values may be taken away or limited. And fear is a normal feeling, but I think the Crucible and modern day witch hunts represent a threat to one of these fears. It's going to be taken away.
And not that we want to stray too far into this, but there's often discussion of those Latin words, logos, pathos, and ethos, and the pathos aspect. My students get trapped on writing the emotion, fear. But if I can get them to connect it to what are they afraid of? It's fear motivated by what? Well, it's the loss of something, or it's the appearance of something. And then the something becomes one of these beliefs and values. Suddenly they're not trapped just saying some of those sentences about, well, they feel fear because they're afraid of what's coming. And you're like, yeah, but what is that? And it just gives them something concrete. And not that I teach to the test, because I don't, but particularly in a timed right setting where it's limited, having this kind of concrete target of one of these values can really help when they're in that kind of stress. So,
thank you.
Yeah, which does actually set up this other text, and I'll try to remember to drop this link directly in there. But this in the PowerPoint, there should be the link to this article. It's from the Atlantic, and I've found it really useful these last few years. It's essentially arguing the point that we need to stop doing either or. We need to stop talking about extremes. In this case, they're writing particularly about political issues, but then I bring it into argument and writing, or when we look at analysis, when we look at the motivations of the speaker, because it's more of a continuum. It's a priority, not good versus evil, right versus wrong. It's that someone has prioritized security over individuality. Not that they've decided individuality is wrong. And as soon as kids start to make that connection, it unlocks a few more possibilities for them as writers. And one of the things that, since both of us are teaching in this combined element of AP Lang and AP US History, one of the things that I've really enjoyed about it, and hopefully you've already kind of seen at this opening, is that I don't stay in the chronological time period of my AP US History co-teacher. I try to make connections that spiral through time. So if he's going to, we're just finishing up Jacksonian period now. If he's finishing up the Jacksonian period, talking about market forces, and we're looking at consumerism in contemporary times or changing jobs, like factory and automation of jobs, that's a connection over time that we try to get them to connect to those beliefs and values. Because the belief and value is persistent. The individual event might be isolated in a time period.
Yeah, and just in the same way that we could look at witch hunts throughout history, you know, I've shared with you too, but other times where we're afraid of the outsider, and what does that look like? To quote Mark Twain, history rhymes. Doesn't repeat itself, but history rhymes.
And then the part that that I think probably makes me most excited as a teacher of the course is digging into this concept of we're looking for complexities and tensions. We're never simplifying. We're always looking at those complications that come out of a text, whether it be a rhetorical analysis or in the arguments themselves, either the students are writing or that they're reading. And I was motivated to start using this language from the new updated scoring guides, where both in rhetorical analysis and in the argument, in the sophistication row, there's the explaining a purpose or function of the passage's complexities or tensions. So I'm always pushing my students to look for where are the tensions? Are the tensions between beliefs and values? Are the tensions between speaker and audience more demographically driven? But I want them to identify those and then connect to the choices that the writer is making. Or when they go to write argument, how can they use that to present evidence? And there's the second rubric. Again, the implications or limitations and those complexities and tensions. And then if we go back to Steve's text, we see it right there.
Right. And let's just look at some of the excerpts here. If we were to import some of that idea right at the beginning, Mr. President, I speak as a Republican, I speak as a woman, I speak as a United States Senator, I speak as an American. At first glance, it looks like it's just parallelism reinforcing all these signature roles. But when we think about the differences among those roles, particularly our students' knowledge of the way women have been represented or misrepresented or underrepresented, then there's a little bit of a disconnect going on there. And again, if we understand the context, we know that Republicans, senators, and Americans don't always have the same perspective. The second paragraph, we can start to teach students that's transitional words, looking for contrasts. Words like but, for example, the United States Senate has long enjoyed worldwide respect as the greatest deliberative body in the world, but recently that deliberative character has too often been debased to the level of a form of hate. And so respect versus hate with that middle marker of the word but, that's an explicit contrast. Notice right in the third paragraph, it's ironic. So students need to know what is a rhetorical choice. There's disconnect that we as senators are silencing our colleagues. And if we look 3 lines from the bottom, without that non-senator American having any legal redress against us, yet if we say the same things in the Senate about our colleagues, we can be stopped on the grounds of being out of order. That transition, some people can speak without censorship, others can, others cannot. And for us to signal that shift, what we sometimes call nuance as well.
And I think we also were discovered as we were putting this together that those signals, and when we look at a construction like this, we can start talking about that thing called line of reasoning that is also sometimes troublesome to put your finger on or to pin down. Is you're seeing through her examination of complexity and tension the reasoning she's trying to take her audience through.
And Lloyd, would you also say too that the more that students can sort of pick at the complexities and tensions, that might be another way of understanding a writer's exigence. You know, sometimes exigence is not something that they just magically divine from the 3 to 4 sentence prompt. Would you say that's one way of maybe determining exigence?
Definitely. Yeah, I think, you know, anytime they can realize what the forces are that have moved or put pressure on someone enough to speak or speak out in the way that they do, that's going to get them closer to exigence than necessarily being told a year or a particular audience even. it's in the text where they determine the exigence often, just as much as any preliminary information. So,
thank you.
Yeah, and then one of the things that both of us have used in the recent years is this concept of the 3 I's, which I learned again sitting in on one of Steve's seminars, and then I've just taken it and I use it all the time with my students. Thinking again about complexity and tensions, thinking about not trying to narrow it down to simple binary responses, right and wrong. What you realize is that there's really this connection between individuals and communities, the institutions or industries in society, and then the ideologies. And I start having students read looking for those perspectives or representations, and how that influences evidence choice, or how the speaker may fit into one of those more neatly, and then realize that their audience is actually representing one of these other elements of those 3 I's. Steve?
Yeah, and I think it's also an occasion for students to think more deeply about an issue. So often emergent readers stay at the character level. So they look at issues relative to a single case study, and how they complicate their thinking by being able to look at more abstract levels, in part is aided by a study of history, because in history we have some very clear-cut institutions, actually in modern times, whether it's a bank or the government or school, and the ideologies, the thinking that comes behind it. So let's take again Margaret Chase Smith. You know, she is trying to fix an institution that has been shifted by an ideology that she disagrees with. She is an individual speaking out against that. So the question we can ask our students is, when individuals make certain choices and what they say or what they do, are they doing it to support an institution? Are they doing it, I think that's the slide, because that's what the institution demands of them? Are they standing up for an individual belief like Thoreau and challenging existing norms? And it's a nice way of looking at the relationship between what a person says or does and the prevailing community and the larger ideology.
And then the idea is that there isn't one set pattern between this. You know, some texts may be driven more ideologically, some texts, and again, just like the beliefs and values, you may have 2 students reading a text, and one says, well, I'm really going to hone in on how this represents the impact on individuals and communities, and someone else says, oh, no. Notice here how institutions are a primary audience for this particular text. And that, again, gives them that opportunity to realize the complexities and tensions, and then to formulate their own responses, even when reading a text that everyone shares. And one text that I use where I found that the 3 I's is particularly helpful is I do an excerpt from Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and I do it in context. I use the visuals, some of which you see here, the photographs from the migrant trains to California, and even some of the WPA advertisements. We do a little bit of visual analysis and imagery to see that what is the time period like before we actually dive into a text, which, although is fiction, is rooted so much in that time period and the realities that I treat it as if it's a document with some literature flair, I guess. And in this particular passage, comes from chapter 11. We talk about how that's important, that it's in the middle of a text as opposed to the beginning and end. It serves a different function, a different purpose. We'd expect something different. But then I have them read through the text. And this one in particular is the description, a contrast between the man who farmed his land with horse and animals versus what is called the machine man or the tractor man. And it's this concern about technology and how that creates a disconnect, literally a disconnect between the human and the earth in which they work. And Steinbeck's really concerned about that. So then we start thinking about the beliefs and values that Steinbeck is focusing on, and how that machine and the earth are having a pretty negative relationship in the 1930s for sure. And then we go to the 3 I's and ask some of these questions that Steve's put together to kind of formulate some meaning from any text.
Right. And so, like I was alluding to a minute ago, to what extent are an individual's actions or beliefs a product of prevailing institutions or ideologies? So, in a moment, we'll return to the Steinbeck excerpt and see what's going on with that. Number two, to what extent, forgive me, Lloyd.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
To what extent are systemic norms a result of a group's desires? And I think that's a word that's fair game for today's high school students. What do we mean by the system? What do we mean when we talk about, for example, systemic prejudice, systemic poverty? What does it mean? How do we get kids to see it's not just about an individual person? We're not just demonizing a single bad apple. And last but not least, do institutions, the ones like we're in, like schools, for example, how do they foster individuality or conformity, which is a huge, huge feature of any society, but particularly one like ours. So, thanks, Lloyd. You there, Lloyd?
Getting them to think about those questions gets them into more in-depth examination of text. So we come back to this text, and this is just a screenshot from one time when we started annotating together. But this realization of how the diction, of how the language is communicating those values. I have them mark up any word with negative connotations, mark up words with positive connotations. Where are they associated? And you begin to pull from it Steinbeck's argument that he's pretty he's concerned about the negative impacts of technology in our world and on humans and on the earth itself. But they're able to then connect it to specific choices the writer made. And then, we tie right back to the text we started with Smith.
And I'll just talk us through this one here. I'll highlight the line from her rhetoric: the people of America and the manner in which we are using or abusing our individual powers and privileges. I would say the line "using powers and privileges" is a shout out to the institution of the United States government and our senators' responsibility when she points out that we are abusing our power and privileges in spite of the prevailing ideology and challenging their roles as senators. In other words, don't let this witch hunt and this fear of communism allow us to move away from our institutional responsibility. So I would say the takeaway, colleagues, from this is that students would need to be taught how a particular rhetoric, references an ideology or an institution, not unlike what Lloyd was sharing with technology and Earth. I mean, we look for patterns, we look for markers that move us back and forth in these three eyes.
And when you get to ideologies, I go ahead and I take my kids back to that beliefs and values page and tell them that they can make those connections there, that, democracy is an ideology, competition, that they can use those. Of course, they can identify other aspects depending on what text you're looking at. But again, it gives them some ground to work from. And then we also discussed the other day about how the three eyes may contribute to that line of reasoning concept as well. That as you go through a text, you can when you start to identify the role or the intention with individuals, institutions, and ideologies, that might also begin to help shape either your own argument as a writer, or as you read someone else's argument, you begin to see the purposeful placement and why they went the way they did.
So let's just look at an example from the Crucible. This is Danforth speaking at 2/3 of the way. While I speak God's law, I will not crack its voice with whimpering. If retaliation is your fear, know this: I should hang 10,000 that dared to rise against the law, and an ocean of salt tears could not melt the resolution of the statutes. Notice, colleagues, Danforth's unflinching adherence to institutional norms. He is going to be the best foot soldier for this prevailing ideology. But notice what's happening here in the play, that anybody who's going to speak out against that ideology, that institutional norm, they get suppressed, they get pushed away, hidden, submerged. And I mentioned this earlier, but I think that so often when our value systems that Lloyd has shared with us are threatened or challenged, I wonder if it's almost a kind of primal response, a tribal response, like I'm going to lose a friend, I'm going to lose a colleague, I'm going to lose my community because my values have been threatened. And I'm working on it, colleagues, but I don't have a fast answer yet. But I think fear so often makes us steadfast in the way we think about things.
Oops, there we go. So again, this concept of tying the literature or the documents to the time period as you're learning the history, but also realizing that if we're going to look at ideologies, if we're going to look at institutions, we're even going to look at individuals and communities, that we can start to take them out of the time period. And if you do work with any of your history colleagues, continuity and change is one of the key concepts, and where many of the questions come from, or one version of questions for AP US history and the other histories as well. That's the one that I've attached to AP Lang. Well, let's talk about continuity and change. Let's talk about the role of technology. Sure, Steinbeck's concern for his reasons in the 1930s. Well, where are we today? And what do our institutions endorse and reflect? And so there's another text, a more recent one. So in 1939, Steinbeck's writing about the separation of man from Earth with technology, the contempt that only comes to a stranger who has little understanding and no relation when that machine is there. He's contemptuous of the land. And then in 2017, the writer Richard Russo wrote an essay. It's in a collection called Two Americas. And he wrote this essay called American Work, which is linked in the PowerPoint as well, that examines kind of the concept of after Donald Trump was elected, whose voices were neglected and not listened to, and is that a reasoning that we need to face and discuss when we talk about ideologies and institutions? And so if Steinbeck's writing about the lack of representation in 39 of hearing one subset of people or one population, one community, in 2017, we have Russo saying, well, in our society, between education and prosperity, meaning that there's something demeaning about unclogging drains and pounding nails, somehow less essential to our national life than, say, writing computer code. They remember a time when work they did was valued and respected. Well, that's what Steinbeck's writing about in 39. It's a common belief and value. It's a common commonality across times that then the students can tap into and say, well, what beliefs and values are driving those, and which communities and institutions are involved? And so I found that to be really helpful and useful in my AP Lang work along with history.
Now we have some projects we want to share with you, but maybe now's a good time before we do that. I don't know about you, Lloyd, but I'm looking in the chat and I don't see any questions. So is it possible that they all come to you? Or
Nope. No. So yeah, what questions do you have, or things that maybe we need to clarify or revisit? We do have a couple classroom assignments we're happy to share with you as well.
All right, Lloyd, I'm going to then move us forward, and we'll allow questions to emerge organically. So, colleagues, one of the things that we wanted to share with you is the application of this learning, meaning that it's one thing to analyze it, but it's quite another thing to apply it to your own learning or to your own creation. And Lloyd already mentioned that he does work with the complexities and tensions, transferring from rhetorical analysis to original argument. And so this is another version of this. I would say things, colleagues, I'm going to make an announcement about this assignment that I say all the time, and that is that people's assignments are like home movies. They make a lot more sense to the people that wrote them than the people that are looking at them, with all respect to the home movies that are out there. So, I'll just tell you the prompt. So we do a lot of work with reparations. Reparations is a great subject for American history and for American studies, but also a standalone AP Language and Comp class, because it naturally invokes a knowledge of history and change over time, just like Lloyd described. I mean, how do you atone for past errors that were centuries old. How do we do that? Or do we do that? So anyway, the writing prompt, which we can access later, essentially says, to what extent are reparations a beginning and an ending? How are they both? So Lloyd mentioned earlier that we want to move away from binary, that it's not just one or the other, but how do we see nuance? How do we find that complexity within that? And also, too, I think the exigence is derived in part by a student's own stance on a subject that they had perhaps very little skin in the game in. In other words, we are beneficiaries of systemic racism or systemic poverty. Beneficiaries, I mean, if we're on the other side of things, but we ourselves may have individually been absent from the actual moments in time. What does that mean for us? And I think for students particularly, where does the rubber meet the road? How much do they see success or the future as a function of a shared experience or a success in quintessential American individuality, a solo shot? Now, one of the things that I've done with this assignment, too, is to make sure that they write to an audience in mind. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you just a sample example, and you can see how this kind of manifests itself. So, Lloyd, if we can move us to the next slide, I think, or if we can click on that one. You have this in your handouts. I'll wait for it to show up on the screen. But I really think it's true for any assignment. You want to assign the audience, and I gave my students a choice about who they could write this to. This was just last December. It wasn't that long ago. So some of their choices were President-elect Biden, and I would point out, what does it mean if there's a friendly audience? Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. I had them write to the current president, Donald Trump. And what does it look like to write to an audience that would be on your side? So to go from there, and allow me, please, just to read this first one to you, and I'll highlight a few things that are going on, and you can kind of see how the student's internalizing this idea of the rhetorical situation. Let me read this, please, and I'll just pause a little bit every now and then. Dear President-elect Biden, as you anticipate the presidency, I would like to offer a word on reparations. During the early 1990s, then President George, which is H.W. Bush, sent letters of formal apology accompanied with $20,000 checks to Japanese Americans who were impacted during internment. These reparations were arguably an overall success. In fact, Professor Eric K. Yamamoto at the University of Hawaii at Manoa recalled witnessing, quote, tears of relief mixed with sighs of joy during a ceremony highlighting these reparations. However, and notice colleagues, how the student is making that shift, that but or that yet. In other words, introducing another side, a complexity or intention. Despite celebrations, an undertone of questioning remained. For example, Vincine Verdun, an African-American scholar, contemplated, why them and not me? Indeed, the debate about reparations for African-Americans who have been impacted by ideals of white supremacy, by the way, as we may know, a phrase our President Biden actually used in his inaugural address, whether indirectly or directly, has persisted many years, even tens of years, longer than debate concerning reparations for Japanese Americans. And frankly, I believe that the ongoing battle over reparations for African Americans is no exception, but rather indicative of a deeper problem that reparations seek to amend, one that, if we are honest, we may be incapable of solving. And colleagues, let me just share with you that notice the move the student's making, rather indicative of a deeper problem. So the student is moving away from that individual community. In other words, we're gonna not just look at who gets the reparations and sort of have this arm wrestling debate about which community deserves X, Y, or Z, but there's a larger ideology in place here that the student is introducing, not getting too heavy-handed there, but already we can anticipate a more inductive move as a student delves into a deeper issue there. And so the samples that you have actually have one for, as I mentioned, to at that point, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, and at that point, President Trump. And, I think, again, you have an opportunity to look at that, but they all essentially illustrate the ideas of our presentation. And I would call this, what is that, in December? What is that, 5 months into the school year? 5 months into the virtual school year. We lost a few weeks there, so maybe it's more like 4 months. But I would hold all those up as really good responses, and they're process essays, colleagues. In other words, they're not time writings. Kids are interacting with each other, with me, blah blah blah. So
yeah, and I like how Steve pointed out, again, like that concept of the 3 I's, whether the kid directly writes about that, the fact that they have that foundation, their background to move from individual community to ideologies or to address the institutions, it's going to lead them to different evidence. It's going to lead them to construct an argument in a different way, or hopefully broaden their arguments at least. And an assignment that I do is something that I actually stress anytime I get a chance to talk with teachers, is trying to find a really rich local event or local issue that your students can dig into. Since I do try to tie it to history, I'm looking for those points in our past. And I teach in a suburb of Omaha. And so this book is actually about the basketball team in Omaha in 1968. And it happens to be the first high school basketball team in the state of Nebraska, in which all 5 starters were African American, and they were the #1 team in the state. And then the week of the basketball tournament, the state basketball tournament, is the same week that George Wallace has booked a political campaign, a rally at an arena just down the road from their high school in 1968 as he's running for president on a platform of segregation. And of course, it's 1968 in America, so we kind of know all those other forces and events that are happening at the same time. And my students, the map here just gives you a sense. The purple eagle here is the school that's mentioned in the book, but I teach out here at this green circle, way out in the suburbs, and they honestly don't know. They know about the school itself because it still exists, but they don't know any of this history. So we read this book. It's about basketball. It's about high school. It's about housing policies. It's about law enforcement. It's about everything, and it helps them see things that they just didn't know, and about their own city, about their own community. And it motivates them to then pursue something that they're interested in. So maybe they're really interested. There's a discussion in this book about foster care. Some of the people in the book have difficulty in that system, and so kids get interested in it and do some research on foster care. Some kids get interested in housing codes in Nebraska. They often think the Jim Crow laws of the South were the only institutional law kind of way of separating communities and separating people by race or ethnicity. And then I show them that we didn't necessarily have Jim Crow laws in Omaha, but we had housing covenants that would separate communities. And they start to dig in and research, and then I bring it to today. So then they start researching, where are we today in Omaha, and what does that look like for housing, for education, these other issues. And then I turn them to what is a manufactured but realistic audience of saying, okay, now you're educated, now you're informed. It's time to write an editorial to your fellow Omaha citizens about the issue that you've become interested in, that you've done the research, that you've done the work. And so I have them write an editorial that could be submitted to the newspaper about at least one of these issues or the impact of these issues, and then move it to, well, what should we do? And the policy or the claim of policy and action can be about individuals, it could be about institutions, but they've got to make that move in their editorial. And so that's how I try to connect it to something more beyond the test itself.
And even interestingly, on the slide where we give additional text that accomplish some of these goals, I would point out that in both project samples from Lloyd and myself, that students are doing their own research. In other words, they're looking to develop their knowledge base. But there's an element of ownership in that, and I think that just struck me. I think as a marker of good arguments. You may know about some of these titles. Just briefly, I think reading them rhetorically asks us to pay attention always to the relationship between author and audience, the time that it was written in, and of course, as Lloyd pointed out at the beginning, how we make them relevant to today. I I think many of these books have a tried and true history, fiction. One that we're actually doing right now, Paul Tough, The Years That Matter Most. This, I think, was published in 2018. But really just calling to task some of the institutional norms about getting into the college that will, quote, make or break your future. And he does that with quite a bit of irony. But I would just offer those as other texts under my watch that we have read or will read in American Studies.
And then this last one of these last slides here just has some of those links right in the PowerPoint to either some of the texts that we've mentioned in this particular presentation tonight, and that some information that might be useful in those areas. And really, we've reached the point where we're done conveying information, but what questions or connections or ideas do you have that you'd like to bring to us or ask us about? In some of the workshops that I do for AP, one of the days that we're together, I have them start scrolling through local news. They have to go to several different websites and start looking at the issues that are involved there. And that's kind of like the shorthand way, if you don't have a full book like Rhythm Boys about the history or about what's happening in your community, just to get people to think about smaller sphere, local issues that they can connect to, as opposed to the national ones that kids are often attracted to, but maybe don't have as close a connection to.
Yeah, I think that's a real powerful point, Lloyd. I think a lot of times when we look at national figures or national issues, it has an abstract quality, and to use a teenager's word, it's less relatable past, sort of intellectual awareness. That's not to say that I'm sure some kids have a personal connection to the issues, but these are broad brushstrokes that these national speakers are making. So looking at local issues, local speeches, local editorials, I can't say enough about, I think, how that really makes students part of that calculus.
Yeah. Or if they want to talk about one of those national issues, I force them to find how it appears in our current, community, in our local community. One of the best examples of that was several years ago when Kaepernick started kneeling during the Star Spangled Banner. I had several students who wanted to write about that issue, but it was a national issue, and I said, "Well, you can't." And then that weekend, the relatively local college football team, the Nebraska Cornhuskers, several of their players knelt during the national anthem. And then the next week, some of the high school players, not from our school, but from surrounding schools, knelt during the Star Spangled Banner. And then they came back to me and said, "Well, Mr. Hoshar, can I write about it now?" And I said, "You bet you can. Yeah, now it's in your community. It's something that you can really see happening."
And I would say too, Lloyd, that one thing that I think is fair game for our students is to have them write about their school. The College Board's a Cook's tour of the AP prompts over the last 5 years. A number of them have asked students to sort of weigh in on their school community or communities with which they're familiar. And I think that's a very deliberate choice on the College Board's part to really give them a community, a context with which they're familiar. So rather than writing about something that they may or may not have a connection with, like kneeling during the national anthem, the honor code, for example, at your school, or a class in creativity at your school. I think those are deliberate choices from the exam writers to have us as teachers of this course to remind students that your audience, your context, should be, again, to quote that teenager word, relatable. And I think there's tremendous value in that.
Yeah, and my colleague who also teaches AP Lang, I do the editorial. He keeps it smaller, and it does have to be a school-related issue, and then they have to find the actual audience they need to write to, and then they get to decide are they doing a meeting with the principal, in which case they prepare notes and set up kind of a short presentation, or are they writing an email to the HR director at our district. And so he's made it even more localized, which I I think it's been more successful than my editorial one because there's an immediacy. There is a real audience, and they actually deliver it. So it's a pretty powerful experience for them to realize that rhetorical situation is not just the fancy thing that we say, but it's the situation they're in when they go to present a message.
Right, and even as schools today find themselves in a rhetorical situation with the pandemic, that when we get a little time and distance will allow them to reflect even again, how that very, very powerful relationship between the speaker, in this case a teacher, and the audience of students, how that was impacted, whether we're doing virtually or whether we have a mask on, and what's surrounding us and what gets priority. I think it'll be a rich opportunity to look at recent events to achieve that as well. Well, Lloyd, I don't know about in Oklahoma, but in Illinois it's 7:29. So I know we're always a minute behind you. But
yeah. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you got something that you can carry with you and modify for your own classrooms. And I appreciate your time. If you have any other questions, let us know.
Likewise, Lloyd, I think our emails are at the beginning of this, right? So
They are. Yep.
So please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. And we thank you again for the privilege of your time. And of course, we wish you the most health and safety and good fortune in the days and weeks ahead.